Okay, we are live. Welcome to Boston Basic Income. I'm Alex Howlett.
I'm Derek Van Gorder.
This week we're discussing Chapter 5 of Stephanie Kelton's Deficit Myth. And the title of this chapter is Winning, in quotes, at Trade. So far the book has mostly discussed the MMT perspective on how domestic economies and how to manage domestic economies, but international trade is kind of a big deal. So does international trade have to be a game with winners and losers, or can we set it up so that everybody wins? I think most economists, are thinking gains from trade, comparative advantage. Trade is something that, at least in expectation, increases the well-being of everybody, maybe with some losers along the way, but the average benefit is better for everyone, right? And then another question we can ask is, how do jobs factor into our calculations of the benefits from trade or the costs of trade in particular? So I'll bring up the first quote from the article here. Myth number 5, the trade deficit means America is losing. Reality, America's trade deficit is its stuff surplus. So yeah, that's exactly right. If you are, so a trade deficit is when you're sending more money out there. So if you're sending away money and you're getting stuff in return, you're trading it for stuff, then, those two things have to kind of be equal and opposite, right? You're spending more money, you're getting more stuff. So that's true. I have no qualms with this framing here. Now, I would say that the reason that a lot of people talk about wanting trade surplus has to do with the labor market. So the reason why you'd want to be have a stuff deficit, the reason why you want to be selling a bunch of stuff is because you want to keep people employed. So, there's kind of the mainstream idea that you want people to have jobs, you want people to be able to earn their money through jobs, that kind of stuff. The more stuff they're making, the more stuff America is making and selling out into the world, the more kind of employed our people can be. And if we're getting our stuff from China or from other countries, then that's foreign workers who get to do the work. Now, from a basic income perspective, just spending money and getting stuff without having to work sounds pretty great because we can, ensure that our consumers have income so they can buy stuff from China. And then China does all the work for us. So that sounds like a good thing. Maybe there are some trade-offs in the sense that you would want to be able to be self-sufficient if you had to be. So if China suddenly cut us off and stopped selling us things, then would we be in a position to adapt and start making our own stuff again? So these are the kinds of things that you need to pay attention to still, even if you don't care about people having jobs per se. So I would say that, the reason that you shouldn't have to worry too much about the trade deficit is largely because we don't have to worry about keeping everybody employed. And I think Stephanie Kelton would say, and she does say in this chapter, that the reason you don't have to worry about the trade deficit is because you can enjoy the stuff surplus and keep people employed in other ways. So she's like, it doesn't have to be this trade dynamic that's what's keeping people employed. We can do that and still get the stuff surplus. So there's kinds of, we both maybe are not so worried about a trade deficit, but for slightly different reasons, or maybe very different reasons.
That's what I was going to ask you about. I've understood for a while that you agree with MMT that trade deficits aren't inherently bad, but would you go so far as to say that if you believe employment is like a good or necessary thing, like that's what we should be targeting, is that kind of a contradiction? Like, is there any way when you're achieving employment through other means, like through a federal jobs guarantee, does accepting the trade surplus still harm your progress towards that goal?
Yeah, and I would say,
Accepting the trade deficit, I meant to say.
Yeah, you could accept the trade deficit, accept the stuff surplus, and keep people employed in ways that are not just producing things for foreigners. So you're still getting more stuff from everyone else, and you're keeping people employed. an easy way to do it is to just employ them unproductively, right? Have them, dig holes and fill them back in again. Then you're not exporting anything. But there are other ways to employ people in at least somewhat productive ways that don't involve, kind of shifting the balance of trade or something like that.
Yeah, it seems like it's likely, I guess it's hard to know, but it seems like it's likely to be more efficient if you do want to get people their incomes through jobs. It's likely to be more efficient to employ them at home than to force a trade deficit. Like, it depends on why there's a trade surplus. It depends on why there would be a trade surplus, but it seems like a lot of the things that we do, at least now, to that end, are just not efficient. Like, if another country can more efficiently make something, or we can automate it or whatever, like, it seems like that's better. And as much as I'm not a fan of a jobs guarantee over a basic income, it does seem like in practice, a jobs guarantee would be at least trying to do kind of like useful things with the jobs. And I think on average, that would probably be more efficient than like big tariffs on other countries creating the jobs, that kind of thing. That's my sense. That's my guess about how that would trade off. So it does seem like MMT and the perspective we talk about in here really have a very similar view of this trade deficit myth, and like there's sort of a separate debate over whether you get people their incomes through a jobs guarantee or through a basic income, but both are kind of pointing out that you can get people their income basically through government spending directly into the economy, as opposed to forcing this kind of these inefficient international conditions that like create artificial demand basically for American labor that isn't really needed to be there. So that does seem like an improvement in either case.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. I think
go ahead. I just had one more point. This is maybe a secondary point. We can table it till later. But another thing that she talks about later on in the chapter is sort of other benefits of countries making their own stuff, which is a little bit different than having a trade surplus or a trade deficit. But she seems to indicate, when she's talking about like developed versus developing nations and stuff, that there is a fragility to not to relying too much on foreign countries for your goods, for your like basic goods and services. So at some point, I'd be curious what your thoughts are on that. I wasn't sure if she was kind of underplaying the benefits of comparative advantage in international trade, or if she really kind of had something there, but she didn't flesh it out enough for me to be sure. So I don't know if that's something we'll get into later in the quotes, but that's related to this point in terms of like, should you make your own stuff or not, basically.
Yeah, that's related to what I was saying about self-sufficiency before. I like to say that self-sufficiency is inefficiency, because if everyone's producing their own stuff, then nobody's specializing, right? And that's true, of course, but then there's also more interdependency. If there's only one producer of all the world's food, and that person, for whatever reason, isn't doing it anymore, then everyone else is in trouble. So you got to you got to have the right mix between specialization, but also redundancy in the global economy. And I don't think we need to go all the way to every country needs to be able to produce all of its own stuff. But certainly there needs to be kind of multiple producers of each thing. And each country maybe wants to have more than one thing that they trade to other people.
Right.
Yeah.
So you're not too, like we talked about with Venezuela in another version of this, you're not like too dependent on one product either. And then if there's something happens with that product, you're in a lot of trouble as a country or something like that.
Yes. If you're Venezuela and the only way you can buy stuff is by selling oil, and then you can't sell your oil anymore, that's a problem.
Right.
So you want to prevent something like that from happening, and that necessarily introduces some redundancy, which is not strictly the most. If you're just trying to most efficient use of resources in the moment, that kind of thing, that's not what that is. But it's important for the system to be able to be robust against unexpected shocks and that kind of thing. Yeah. So let's go to the next quote here. When an external, i.e. currency devaluation, isn't an option, countries often pursue internal devaluation as a way to win at trade. The neoliberal term of art for this particular strategy is structural reform. It's the polite way of describing an agenda aimed at driving down labor costs, wages, and pensions to increase competitiveness by reducing the costs of production. Essentially, it means that a country uses weaker labor as a substitute for weaker currency. So this is an interesting way of framing things. I guess you could ask if your goal is solely to maximize the trade surplus, to export as much stuff as possible, then this, these two things could trade off against each other. But a lot of times, when people are thinking about trade surpluses, they are thinking about workers and jobs, and they're devaluing the currency to decrease the price of exports, so more people will buy stuff from your country, and then more people will be better employed, that kind of thing. So if you are driving down labor costs, wages, and pensions, then you're not really going towards the same end as people are usually going towards when they are trying to, have a trade surplus and boost jobs and that kind of thing.
For people who aren't super familiar with it, which is partially myself, I mean, can you just walk me through the logical chain? How is it that changing the value of the currency will decrease the price of exports, which then leads to this change in the bargaining power of labor? What's the mechanism proposed here?
So the mechanism for devaluing the currency is kind of flooding the, well, there's a few different things you could do. One is that the central bank could just sell a bunch of their own currency onto the foreign exchange markets and buy up, other currencies. So that will drive down the price of your own currency with respect to the other global currencies. Now, there are a lot of kind of interrelated interaction effects and everything with, the price level and everything like that. But the, exchange rates can be very volatile, and you can push them around without moving domestic prices that much. But when you push around exchange rates, it is going to push around the prices of imports and exports more than it pushes around the other prices. So you get this kind of outsized effect on imports and exports. So if you make your exports cheaper in the global economy by devaluating or depreciating your currency, then more people are going to buy your stuff. And at the same time that that's happening, imports, if your consumers want to buy imports from foreign countries, that gets more expensive. So you're pushing more in the direction of greater exports and fewer imports at the same time.
And you're saying this is pursued primarily as by policymakers as a way to kind of get your domestic economy to produce more stuff instead of relying on cheaper imports from everyone else.
Yeah, and you want to produce more stuff because it keeps people employed, essentially.
Right. It's funny because Kelton describes this as like kind of she says it's a polite way of referring to driving costs of production down. Of course, like driving costs of production down, like there's a lot of ways that could occur. So I don't know. It seems like there's something more specific going on here.
Well, when she's talking about actually, pushing down wages, that's kind of what she's more complaining about. I mean, in the basic income world, lower wages is maybe a good thing. Labor is cheaper. That's fantastic. The consumers still have their money because they're getting that from the basic income. We don't have to pay people to work as much. That reflects the fact that we're using labor more and more efficiently. And it also reflects the fact that workers are getting less and less of their income in a way that's dependent on an employer, on a boss, that kind of thing. So the lower the wages are, the more freedom people have, essentially. But obviously in international trade that can get complicated. Maybe the wages are low because the wages are going to people in China who are being employed against their will, or I shouldn't say that necessarily that's of course not always the case in China, but there are people have problems with working conditions. There's a question you can ask: to what extent people would care about foreign labor conditions if they didn't think it was like unfair that these foreign workers were able to kind of compete with their better conditioned jobs or something like that. I don't know. So it gets there's a lot of complicated stuff that kind of comes into the picture there. But if we don't care about jobs, and we don't care about wages, and we don't care about labor conditions, I think it gets a lot easier to think about trade and the benefits of trade. And then you don't have to think about jobs and employment and any of that. You can just think about, okay, well, how do I, how do we ensure that, you know, that different countries are specializing to the extent that that's efficient, but also that there's enough redundancy in the system, right? That there's this trade-off that we were talking about before. And then you don't even have to think about this labor stuff. But, you know, obviously that's not how we talk about it in the real world.
Yeah, I think this paragraph is a nice example of the kind of contradictions with that, because it sort of assumes it's obvious that like lowering wages is a bad thing, but then it concedes right away that you're talking about lowering production costs. And I would hope that most people would agree that like lowering your costs is a good or beneficial thing, right? And so the question is then like, what is it about wages and labor, like why are we unable to make this connection and say, oh yeah, well that's just reducing costs, which is good for efficiency?
Yeah, so I think that's exactly right. Are we thinking of wages as a cost, or are we thinking of wages as the source of consumer income? And if you're thinking of wages as a cost, you want them lower. And if you're thinking of wages as a source of consumer income, then you want them higher. But if you have a basic income, you don't need to think of wages as a source of consumer income anymore. They're only a cost. They're only an incentive to get people to do work they wouldn't otherwise do. Now, obviously, this again is more complicated if the United States has a basic income, but maybe the countries that we're importing from don't, that kind of thing. So maybe in the United States, we don't care about wages. We don't care about the wages that Americans receive, but maybe we should, have some kind of sympathy for, situations that cause lower wages abroad, that kind of thing. Obviously we could solve the problem by paying a basic income to everyone in the world and not just American citizens. But, maybe we would do other things that are in between that and just not caring about foreign workers at all. So let's, Austin has some comments in the YouTube live stream. He says, he's quoting me, the lower the wages are, the more freedom people have. And he says, that's like what a caricature of a basic income advocate would say. Well, maybe I am a caricature of a basic income advocate.
Yeah, I would emphasize that, and obviously that sounds jarring in today's paradigm, but what you have to realize, remember, is that work is a social cost. You're using up people's time that they could be doing other things. Like Alex was saying before, technically, if people are living more on the basic income and less on their wages, then that means they have more freedom to pursue other things. So the wage is, of course, a benefit to that particular person, but from the larger economic system, you're still paying the cost. You're losing that person's time. They're losing their time. So it really does make sense, I think, at the macro level to think of wages as a cost, not as a benefit.
One wrinkle here in terms of wages and the relationship to freedom is like, it depends on whether you're talking about dollars per hour or dollars, like what percentage of my income or like comes from wages. And those are kind of different things, and both could be reflected similarly. Like most could look similar in certain statistics, but if I'm paid like $5 an hour instead of $10 an hour, that doesn't necessarily reflect greater freedom that I'm paid $5 an hour versus 10. Like maybe I'm still doing fine in both cases, but it's not necessarily reflecting greater freedom. It kind of, I think Alex, you were getting at the idea that like overall in the economy, people are getting more of their money from a basic income and less of their money from wages. But there are other ways. But like if time is really what's important, as Derek's pointing out, then like if I'm spending the same amount of time, we'll have to think that through. But anyway, I'll stop with that point about like per hour and versus like percentage of my income. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, and sorry, one more thing I'll add before you respond, Alex, is like another aspect of this, I think, is that you're thinking of a calibrated basic income. So I don't know if you want to expand on how that relates to your statement, because like not everybody is thinking of that when they talk about this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, so the idea is that basic income is a way of getting people money, right? It's an amount of money that kind of goes to everyone evenly. And then the question is, what are you doing that instead of? So, Austin has a few more comments. He says, lowering wages is a bad thing, even if you have a basic income. Well, the question is, why are the wages the way they are? what's the mechanism that we're using to get spending money into the hands of consumers? If we're overstimulating the financial sector to push money to people through jobs, then basic income means we don't have to do as much of that. So we can kind of rein in our monetary stimulus or our overly expansionary monetary policy. And then, yeah, kind of on average, in expectation, for the average person, you would expect that basic income, higher basic income means lower wage income. In terms of the per hour prices, so Bethany brought up per hour prices, that's kind of maybe a separate discussion and maybe kind of harder to tease out. Austin says a basic income would drive up wages in terms of per hour prices. I don't think that sounds right. Certainly it would drive down overall wage income. And then you'd have to kind of do an analysis of, okay, well, how much of people's time actually counts as labor time, and what are the price we're assigning to the different hours and stuff like that. I don't really like to get into that because everyone has 24 hours in a day. And some of those hours we kind of arbitrarily deem to be, working hours. And then we call that whatever money they get for their work, and then whatever we call working hours, that's how we determine what their hourly wage is or something like that. I'm not sure how useful any of these calculations are. And honestly, I don't really care, right? People are better off if they have more money that's not tied to any obligation or anything like that. And then everything else can kind of shake out how it shakes out. My intuition is that, in terms of how we divide between person's working hours and person's leisure hours and all of that, if we do it intuitively or something, then yeah, wages will kind of go down in a basic income world. But there'll be a lot of people who maybe don't have jobs or who are spending their time in wageless ways. Does that mean that their wages are zero? So are they really working or not? Are they in the labor market or not? You can get into all kinds of this stuff. So yeah, let's, Bethany, do you have something you want to add?
No, sorry, I should have remuted. We can get to the next question.
Just one really brief summary of that is like how I like to think about it is if you're thinking about wages as incentives that get people to do work they would otherwise prefer not to do, then if you imagine a world, basic income or not, where wages are getting higher, then you're kind of implying that there's a lot more work being done that people don't want to do. And that's why the wages are getting higher, because they'd really prefer to do something else. If you imagine a world where we have more work around that maybe people kind of enjoy, then you would expect the wages to get lower for the exact same reason that you don't get paid to do your hobbies. The more that work becomes like a hobby for those people anyway, we will expect those wages to go down. Whereas, of course, there will always be some unpleasant jobs that maybe basic income will drive the wages up, right? But why would we want to live in a world where we have to be paying people more to get them to do stuff they would prefer not to do? In an ideal world, you would hope the objective would be people get to spend time doing things that they like to do.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's an important point. Some wages are going to have to go up, and then some wages are going to go down in a basic income world. And that's if you're assuming that kind of the jobs are fixed and you still need to get the same amount of work done. You're going to have to pay some people more to do that work than you did before, because they have the freedom to, not do that work because they don't need the wage as much or that kind of thing. But you also have to keep in mind, what are our economic policies going to do in terms of the existence of those jobs in the first place? So maybe there's a hypothetical job where you'd have to pay people more to get them to do it, but that job doesn't exist because it was only there as a byproduct of the fact that we were stimulating the labor market to create jobs for people or something like that. So there's all of these different factors kind of going into it. Let's go to the next quote. As MMT economist Pavlina Cherneva has documented, unemployment resembles an epidemic. Like a virus, it affects other people nearby, resulting not only in lost income, but higher mortality and suicide rates, and a permanent decline in well-being. But it's easier to blame immigrant workers, foreign currency manipulators, or even global technology than to come to terms with the fact that joblessness is an official policy in the United States. So that's some pretty strong language right there.
Yeah, I mean,
okay.
I was just going to say, lost income might be the cause of these other things. I mean, I think it's a little more complicated than that right now, but it's like slight, I don't want to say misleading, but it's definitely a choice to say like not only lost income, but also higher suicide rates, permanent decline in well-being. But like, it's not clear that those aren't side effects of lost income.
Yeah, and if you think about what a job is it's, paying people to do something that they wouldn't have done otherwise if they hadn't been paid. So there are, a lot of psychological effects that have to do with, having a job and that kind of thing. But all of these are kind of a side effect or a consequence of the fact that we've set up our society and we've set up our economy in such a way that it provides these incentives for people to do this thing. Obviously, Bethany, you came on to the podcast once and you talked about, cultural incentives and that kind of stuff. And yeah, all of that is true, but you have to ask where it's coming from. And it ultimately comes from the fact that this is a thing where you're pulling someone away from what they would otherwise want to do. And if they're internalizing, some sort of self-worth from the fact that they're participating in it, then that's great as an incentive for them. Maybe it means you don't have to pay them as much, that kind of thing if you're the employer. But it's all kind of tied into this thing, and people's, culture can shift and people's psychology can shift.
I think of how a lot of the basic income advocates will point to studies showing how income kind of increases people's well-being and decreases mortality rates and things like that. So it would be funny to try to tease out exactly, like Bethany was saying, which is caused by which here. But also, I think it's worth noting that, like, from Alex's point of view, I think you would fully concede that if it did turn out to be the case that after you have an optimal basic income in place and it turns out that like humans just like really want to be paid to be busy and they suffer psychological problems because that's not happening. You could create jobs to solve that problem to sort of make people happy, but at least then you'd be clear about like what resource costs you were giving up, and you'd understand that these jobs were not actually necessary to help the economy or help produce goods.
Yeah, or maybe even create activities that don't necessarily pay the person, but activate that same psychology. Like maybe I want to pay to be able to spend my time doing a particular thing. Maybe it's, being in a sports league or something like that. But we wouldn't necessarily call that a job anymore. So you can kind of generalize from this stuff, and you can say people spend their time in certain ways. Maybe sometimes they're being paid to spend their time, how they spend it, or maybe sometimes they're paying, depending on which way the benefit is going, that kind of thing. The compensation goes in the opposite direction, right? So I think something I like to say is that if we were creating jobs solely for the benefit of workers, then these and doing it consciously, right? Like this is, how we're thinking about designing our jobs and that kind of thing. Then the jobs that we have today are not the jobs that we would have created. And if we were creating jobs solely for the product of the labor, to get some benefit to consumers or something like that, then these are not the jobs that we would have created either, right? There's kind of, we're kind of stuck in this, kind of make work, and we don't know that it's make work. We're using economic policy to boost employment and, force people to do things that they don't really want to do, that they wouldn't have to do, they wouldn't need to do if we had a basic income, that kind of thing.
And MMT's, just to be fair to MMT, their response to that probably would be that, well, a federal jobs guarantee, you're right, and we're not creating the jobs we should be creating to benefit workers. A federal jobs guarantee will create the jobs to benefit workers.
Yeah. So then, if you're really, and instead of calling them workers, let's call them people. If you're really saying like, okay, we want to create activities that benefit people, for the benefit of people, that they can, benefit from performing the activities, right? Then what does that look like? And at that point, we need to be dropping this notion that it's somehow contributing to the economy's output or something like that. We need to think about these things separately, and we need to recognize that if we're doing something for the benefit of the people, yeah, then maybe that uses up resources. Maybe creating activities for people uses up resources. But yeah, maybe the benefit is worth the cost sometimes, and that's okay. I don't think job guarantee supporters are thinking about it that way. They're thinking that, hey, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. Hey, there's a lot of workers who need jobs. Let's play matchmaker. Let's match the workers up with the work that needs doing, and everyone's better off. What they're maybe not factoring in is the fact that we are using economic policy to create the conditions that cause people to need the jobs in the first place to the extent that they do. And basic income can alleviate some of those conditions. And some of those conditions are necessary because some of the work is necessary, right? But I would say only create the conditions, only create the need or desire to go out and earn money to the extent that it's actually balanced against some work that you need doing, that the cost is worth the benefit of pulling people away from their time. If you just arbitrarily keep the basic income at 0 and everyone needs a job, and you don't view that as something that can change, then it might look like, well, these people need jobs and this work actually is beneficial to society. Everyone's better off if we play matchmaker. But it turns out that maybe the benefit that you get from that isn't as high as the benefit that you would have gotten from creating the conditions that would allow the people not to work those jobs in the first place, and that the benefit you get from that work is not worth the cost of forcing people to need to do it.
Yeah, I'll just underscore that I don't think, so at least Stephanie Kelton is thinking of the jobs guarantee as a way to create like something for people to do because they need to be paid to do something to be happy, maybe a little bit, but I think she's definitely thinking of it as like, and these jobs will be productive at the same time. So she's kind of like, those jobs are then like unlikely to be optimized for one or the other. I think they still fall into the same kind of middle ground trap that Alex is talking about. Yeah, that's my sense.
Yeah, and it's certainly better than overstimulating the financial sector to to stimulate private sector job growth, unproductive private sector job growth. So that's true. Then we get into the whole issue that MMT people want to keep interest rates low, and how they're gonna manage that. But we don't need to get into that at this particular moment. Let's go into the next quote. A gold standard is only credible if the government can make good on its promise to convert the currency into gold at a fixed price. Having enough gold was critical, and running a trade surplus was the surest way to build up a country's gold reserves. Yeah, so if the money is gold, and you can't print more of it, at least the base money of the economy, right? Then if you are selling more stuff, then you're kind of stockpiling gold. And that's something that, if you don't want to run out of gold, because then you won't be able to maintain the gold peg, and then you're off the gold standard. So this is important. If you're not in a gold standard world, if you're in a fiat world, you're in a goods standard world. The difference is that you don't stockpile goods, really. Goods are consumed, unlike gold. So it's a matter of, what are the flows of production? And if you are forcing more goods toward you, then you're benefiting immediately and getting the consumer benefit from having consumed the good, and the other country is stockpiling. If you're the United States, the other country is stockpiling your dollars that you issued in order to buy the goods. One thing that's tricky here is that in a gold standard world, gold sits at the top of the hierarchy, and in terms of international payments, you do see when the flows aren't offsetting, you do see a movement of gold, a shipment of gold, and the gold is in the money. So the gold is the money, right, in this context. So the gold moves in the opposite direction of the goods. And in the goods standard world, the goods are the standard, and the goods can't move in the opposite direction of the goods because they are the goods. So you're making payments with the thing that's next further down in the hierarchy, which is your dollars. So it's more like the dollars are the gold, that pays for the goods. I don't know if that was necessary to get into all of that. But in both cases, the government has to make good on its promise to convert the currency into the thing that is promised. So in a gold standard world, that promise is with respect to gold, and in a fiat currency world, that promise is in respect to goods.
I've sort of gotten into the habit of thinking that no matter whether you have a gold standard or not, your economy is always operating on some kind of good standard. Like that's a promise you have to keep, and the gold standard is something you can do on top. And I'm curious, like the way Stephanie Kelton writes about it, she often sort of implies that like, okay, we were under this certain paradigm and there were constraints there that were a problem. And then we chucked that in by the 1970s, 1980s, and now we have this new thing. And I'm sort of wondering like, well, to what extent did the good standard always kind of trump the gold standard? And could we have just said, well, it's not like everyone's going to show up and try to exchange their base money for gold all at the same time. And like, would it have been possible? Is it really like, to what extent is the gold, like, is it really important that base money be, exchangeable for gold? And to what extent could you kind of fudge that and just be like, well, there's a lot of more currency in circulation buying goods than there is gold anyway, and we could sort of keep going indefinitely like that.
Yeah, and it's certainly true that we had to move away from the gold standard. So there were some constraints that we needed to get out of. But a question we can ask is, what constraints were there under a gold standard that are still there in a global fiat money system that maybe might not be so obvious? So just breaking free of the gold standard, it doesn't mean that the money is I owe you nothing, right? It doesn't mean that you can just do whatever you want with your money and you don't have any constraints. But there are some things that you are free not to do. And I like that you brought up that there's kind of this implicit good standard behind the gold standard, right? The reason why we use gold or why we used gold as our currency standard, as our international currency standard, was because it had a relatively stable price with respect to goods, with respect to tradable goods in the international economy. And there was a bit of a transition starting in, after World War I, where we started thinking, well, maybe instead of pegging the currencies to gold, we'd start pegging gold to the currency. So you still had, you came back to a gold standard in the 1920s, but it was a different gold standard. You were keeping the price level stable and then keeping gold stable with respect to the currency. So there was more direct, especially in the United States, there was more direct, price level management, and then the gold was kind of tacked on top of that instead of the other way around. We're kind of implicitly piggybacking on the price stability of the gold in order to get your price level management, which is what it looked more like in the 19th century.
From your understanding, would you agree with Stephanie Kelton's characterization that like the decision to abandon the gold standard was motivated explicitly by a recognition on the part of policymakers that there was a need for more fiscal space than could be achieved while keeping gold as base money? I think she suggests that during the chapter.
Yeah. So I think certainly they wanted more fiscal space. Nixon wanted to get reelected. He did kind of some shifty stuff, which I think she alludes to in the chapter, which is that he wanted to keep interest rates low to stimulate the economy, but then he also instituted price controls so that people wouldn't see the inflationary effects until after the election and that kind of stuff. I think there was a lot of political stuff there. I don't think it was necessarily some, insight. It wasn't like a light bulb went off in our society's head and we figured something out. There were pressures that were happening. Other countries were claiming gold from the United States under the Bretton Woods Agreement. And there was concern that, if you just kept going like this, we'd run out of gold reserves, right? So there are other solutions besides going off gold. You could revalue it or, other various things, but that's what we decided to do. It wasn't we weren't forced off gold as violently as maybe the United Kingdom was in the 1930s or something like that. It was a decision, and we didn't have to make that decision. But eventually, we probably would have had to make that decision. We didn't have to make it then, but we did. And it was partly politically motivated. And then we had stagflation of the 1970s. I don't think we were more enlightened and that's why we did it or something. So let's see here. Oh, there's more comments in the YouTube live stream. Yeah, Austin is just commenting more on, jobs that could be eliminated if you had more automation and basic income and, what would happen to wages and stuff like that. And honestly, we already had that discussion. So I don't think we really cared that much about these these comments. So let's move on to the next quote here. Even when high interest rates succeeded in protecting gold reserves, the policy often had devastating consequences. That's because rising interest rates frequently triggered an economic slowdown, which meant that many of the citizens of the affected country had to endure domestic recessions and entrenched unemployment. So this is interesting too, because the high interest rates, it's more obvious that you're doing monetary tightening with high interest rates to attract the gold reserves. If you're in a gold standard world, it's more obvious that that's what's happening than if you're in a fiat currency world. Now the question is, did it have to be this way? Did it have to trigger an economic slowdown? Did it and then do we have to be in a situation where people are needing jobs, where they care about being unemployed and stuff like that? If you have a basic income, then you can have higher interest rates at the same time that the economy is doing well and continuing to go strong, because you haven't choked off the source of consumer income. Businesses are still going to be able to sell their products. It might be harder for them to borrow and invest, or it's more expensive for them to do that. But you're not kind of throwing a wrench in the works of the economy when you raise interest rates and you have an alternative mechanism to ensure that consumers are always able to spend.
I like to sometimes phrase it as that it's in a world with higher interest rates, but a higher basic income, higher consumer spending. You're making it harder for businesses to borrow. That's true, but you're also making it easier for them to collect profit from consumers. So if you have businesses that are trying really hard to do that, that's great. That's great for those businesses. And the fact that borrowing is a little bit harder can be offset by the easier profit you can make selling goods that consumers want to buy.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And then if you are borrowing and you are paying the higher prices, then maybe you're doing it because or you're confident that you have a way to make money doing something real that's actually going to benefit the people, benefit consumers. Today, there's a lot of borrowing, to make money because, oh, maybe I can borrow in order to lend or invest in an asset. And, you've got these kind of feedback loops and upward price spirals of asset bubbles and that kind of thing. If you have high enough interest rates, tight enough credit conditions, then you can really rein in the financial sector to be doing what it's supposed to do, which is to finance real investment that's actually going to produce good stuff for people. All right, let's go to the next one. Monetary sovereignty is key to understanding MMT. Governments need a high degree of monetary sovereignty in order to exercise policy autonomy. That is, to be able to run their fiscal and monetary policies without fear of painful backlash from financial or foreign exchange markets. Many countries possess, but don't take full advantage of their monetary sovereignty. So this chapter, we were a little bit critical earlier in the book, but this chapter really gets into the idea that monetary sovereignty is a continuum. Now, the question is, to what extent is it true that there are countries that possess a lot of monetary sovereignty and aren't taking full advantage of it? The United States, maybe perhaps we're imposing unnecessary budget restrictions on ourselves, as Stephanie Kelton, mentions again and again, and kind of highlights. And then, there are other countries that have put themselves in positions where they've given up their monetary sovereignty, like the countries in the European Union, that kind of thing. However, there are a lot of countries where it's not clear if they decided to do things in a certain way, and that, sacrificed their monetary sovereignty, or they just lacked it in the first place. They didn't really have that much fiscal capacity, and that forces them to borrow in the dollar, that kind of thing. And this is one of the things that Stephanie Kelton emphasizes, that if you are importing all of your stuff and you're paying in dollars, that means you have to get the dollars from somewhere to pay. That means you're borrowing dollars, and that can you're borrowing in a currency that you didn't issue, and that can be a problem when it comes to monetary sovereignty. The question we can ask is the fact that you're borrowing in dollars what's undermining your monetary sovereignty, or is the fact that you don't have monetary sovereignty what's forcing you to borrow in dollars?
It seems like later on, or somewhere in the chapter, Stephanie gets into this a bit, right? Like she talks about why some of these countries have to borrow in dollars, and doesn't necessarily say that they could just stop doing that, or they could just issue their own currency. Like I don't remember her saying that developing countries should just issue their own currency. Like if they're pegging to another, they should stop right away or something like that. I didn't see her give like those easy solutions. It seemed like she was acknowledging that there were conditions that led them to need to do this. She didn't maybe explicitly talk about stabilizing the currency as much as you and I might, but it seemed implicit to me, and maybe I was just reading into it, but it seemed implicit in what she was talking about. And what it sounded like she wanted them to do were tangible changes to their economy that would lead them towards having more genuine, a more genuine basis for having a better currency that they could control, that would be more, robust or whatever. And those were things like investing in different industries. And I don't know, she didn't really go into it in depth, so I wasn't totally sure about those recommendations. But they're in that section, she seemed to be kind of criticizing the international advice that these countries had been given, and saying that basically they were investing and developing their economy in a suboptimal way, as opposed to just saying that they could have this sovereignty right now if they only knew that they should just stop pegging to gold or something like that.
Yeah, I think that's right. She's certainly emphasizing that there are countries that are being put in a position to do things that are not optimal, that are kind of holding them back from achieving monetary sovereignty. I'm just going to go quickly into the next quote, which is actually related to this. Most developing economies are at the weaker end of the sovereignty spectrum. Even those that can issue a non-convertible fiat currency usually can't afford to ignore fiscal and trade imbalances. That's because most poorer and developing nations rely on imports to meet vital social needs: food, oil, medicines, technologies. So this is the idea that, kind of what we were talking about before. How much of your own stuff do you need to produce, or how diversified does your economy's production need to be in order, I guess. So we were talking about robustness to shocks, but also in order to not have to be beholden to international interests that might not be aligned with your best interests. So that's another example, or to be able to get the IMF to back off, that kind of thing. Can you get yourself in a position where you don't have to borrow from them and accept these conditions, that kind of stuff. I would also just highlight the word non-convertible here again. So non-convertible fiat currency. So of course, fiat currency is convertible into goods. So this is just bringing the emphasis back into, like, it's not money if the price level isn't reasonably stable. It's kind of a side point.
It's interesting that in this paragraph and in this section of the book, kind of like Bethany was saying, she is sort of emphasizing the spectrum of monetary sovereignty, and that she's describing poorer countries who have less monetary sovereignty because they can't afford the same kind of fiscal expansion that the U.S. can, because of their reliance on imports, or they're limited in their domestic productive capacity. So you have this question of affording, defined in terms of like real stuff and the real economy. Although if you ask her and other MMT advocates about why the U.S. is monetarily sovereign, the first answers you usually hear are about how, well, the government is the currency issuer, and they're using tax to drive value of this currency, right? So that's kind of an interesting, I don't know, maybe a contradiction or something to maybe track further into the book. Like, to what extent does MMT define monetary sovereignty in terms of the way we would, in terms of like access to real resources and how productive the economy is and how willing other foreign actors are to trade with you. And then where does this whole story about taxation and political authority, like where does that actually factor in? If these countries lack the monetary sovereignty, why shouldn't they just increase taxes to drive more currency and to become their own sovereign currency issuer?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Oh, sorry. Did you want to respond to that? Oh, I'll just say, this is a great point, Derek. And I think it's not really about the sovereignty here, perhaps, or maybe that's part of it, but this is reminding me a lot of Alex's model where he might treat a foreign country as a firm or just any, part of what can be part of the country's productive capacity. So when I'm thinking about a developing nation in terms of that framework, there are two issues relative to maybe a more developed nation. So one is that the domestic capacity isn't as developed. Like you can't get it, you can't make as much stuff. So if you're thinking about how much you could spend there, even if you were like a fully sovereign, if you're fully sovereign over your currency, the issue isn't that. It's just that you're limited, the way any country is, by like what productive capacity you have, and you don't have as much domestically. So that's like one part. So it's not so much that like you're not sovereign, it's just that you don't have that much capacity. And then you don't have as much capacity in terms of foreign people wanting to give you stuff, perhaps. And this is where like the currency stuff gets in. Like maybe your currency isn't really in high demand. So we talk about how in the US, like a lot of people are willing to trade us. A lot of countries are willing to trade us cheap stuff right now because they're kind of happy to take the dollars. And like if that changed, in a sense, our productive capacity would be lower. And so for these developing nations, they kind of have it on both fronts where they don't produce as much domestically, and like people aren't so like excited to like get their currency and give them stuff for it. So they have it seems to me like in some of these cases, the issue isn't that they're not sovereign over their currency or that their currency doesn't have stable value, perhaps, like you're pointing out. Like it's not that, it's just that they don't have that much spending that they can absorb without inflation or some other problem, because they just don't have capacity on these two fronts in the same way that a developed country does. And this seems like a different issue than for example, what I think she's rightly pointing out with like the EU, where they might have a lot of productive capacity in terms of what they could even produce domestically, but they can't spend as much as they could even support because they have these other limitations on their currency sovereignty. Let's say if you're like Switzerland, just Germany or whatever, like you might not be able to spend as much, or Greece even, as much as you could support with your own capacity because of the currency issue. So like that actually seems like a sovereignty issue, whereas this developing nation thing, it seems like I'm not sure if these cases are really about currency sovereignty versus productive capacity, including kind of foreign imports and what you're able to do with that. I don't know if you want to comment on that, Alex, since I was talking about your model.
Yeah. A lot of times MMT emphasizes, as Derek was pointing out, you have the political power or the military power to force people to pay taxes to you, and that's where the monetary sovereignty comes from. So this chapter raises the question: okay, to what extent is it that? To what extent is it, having the capacity to produce goods and services? And certainly, I would emphasize the latter in terms of like giving value to a currency. In terms of its function, it's not an IOU for taxes, it's an IOU for goods and services, for the economy's products. So in order to have a strong currency, you need to be able to force a flow of goods and services in the direction of the holder of the money who wants to claim goods and services, right? That's what it's all about. So I would say the taxation can be part of that, can help support that. And military power can help support that too. But it's interesting, and we should pay attention to this. I think it's nice to see Stephanie Kelton talking about this, and I wonder how integrated it is with kind of some of the other points that she's making. So let's go to the next one. By running trade deficits, the U.S. allows these countries, other foreign countries, to build up their U.S. dollar reserves. Those dollars are a lifeline to the food, medicines, and other critical imports that many developing countries depend on for survival. They also help many indebted nations earn the currency they need to repay loans to the IMF and other foreign lenders. In a very important sense, America's trade deficits are not optional. Much of the world simply must run trade surpluses with America. So we had a discussion on here a while ago about Dutch disease, which is the idea that a country has one export, and that export gets so cheap that instead of producing their own, cars and other things, they export the oil, and they can get money for that to import all the other stuff. So this Dutch disease is kind of one of the ways in which you can get into this position where your country is dependent on one export. And the article we read by Jake Fagan was emphasizing, or was suggesting, that the United States was experiencing Dutch disease, and our export was the dollar itself, right? Everybody needs to use the dollar as their as the world reserve currency. So that means we export money essentially and get stuff. So there's no physical good that we're trading. It's our money that everybody else is using. So that's an interesting point, and it kind of prompts the question of, well, what is causing us to be in this position? What would happen if we, weren't the world's reserve currency anymore? What does that shift look like? We can maybe look back to interwar, World War I, World War II period when the United Kingdom, the pound was previously the world reserve currency, actually kind of backed by gold, but it was the pound, right? And then the transition away from that, maybe for some insights.
I mean, there's a lot to unravel there, but I guess, for me, I just like to think about the thought experiment of, it's clear. I think what this paragraph does make clear, and I think what we would agree with, is that the world does need a global currency issuer, right? Like there needs to be a global reserve currency, and someone needs to manage that. Someone needs to be performing that role. If you were imagining just the U.S. Economy as just part of the world economy that was benefiting from that outflow of dollars, that might be different than if we were dividing the world up into separate national economies, each with their own currency. Like it feels less complicated to me when I picture the issuance of currency just being a problem to solve for its own sake.
Yeah, lots of interesting questions here. Let's go to the next one. I'm skipping ahead a little bit. In the end, Volcker's rate hikes drove many developing countries into crisis, fueling a rapid economic downfall from which some countries have yet to fully recover. So before the 1980s, countries really didn't default on their sovereign debt. And then the Volcker rate hike happened to kind of rein in inflation in the United States. But then all these other countries are either pegged to the dollar or somehow associated with the dollar, and those interest rates leaked into these other countries, and then they suddenly couldn't pay their debts anymore. Their dollar-denominated debts, or their kind of debts that were associated with the dollar. So you had this kind of global monetary tightening that forced defaults of entire countries, especially in Latin America. So an interesting question we could ask is, we often talk about increasing the basic income at the same time we increase interest rates. What about all these other countries that kind of have to follow, that our interest rates are going to affect them too? So I actually haven't thought about this that much, but it's an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah, this seems like really sure what the answer is. Like, do you think that people would stop using the dollar?
Well,
hike the interest rates too high, or like what would people do in response?
Yeah, I mean, so when you hike the interest rates, that's tightening credit conditions and actually probably strengthening the purchasing power of the dollar. So the dollar still, like in terms of its function as a standard, it's not going to be having any problems per se. And we're doing it to the extent that it keeps domestic price levels stable, right? The domestic purchasing power of the dollar. But internationally, in terms of an international currency, that's not the price level that you're worried about as much. You're more worried about, well, what's the average price of tradable goods that can be traded in the international economy, and if that gets pushed around, and then if other people's domestic currencies are linked up to the dollar, what problems do you have there? Because the stability of the dollar isn't really designed or targeted towards those particular currencies or those particular countries. So I don't know the answer. I do know that you could solve this by like I always say, paying out a global basic income if you're the United States. My sense is that if you're paying a basic income to American citizens, and they are spending that money to buy imports from Mexico, India, China, anywhere, right? Then those other countries are going to have indirectly through our consumer spending are going to have indirectly more access to dollars, even though interest rates might be higher. So you might see some of the same effect where borrowing is more expensive, but there's more money out there anyway to kind of compensate for it. So you might just see a similar thing happen throughout the world.
Yeah, that's a good point.
That makes sense to me. Another way of thinking about it would be that if the US government found that it could benefit its economy by raising interest rates while simultaneously being more generous with fiscal policy, i.e. a basic income, that could conceivably put pressure on other countries to do the same thing. They accept the internationally pressured up higher interest rates and then combat the problems of that by following suit and putting in more fiscal policy. So it could pressure them to do that in the same way that in the 80s, it may have pressured them to default on their debt.
Yeah. And Neil had a comment in the Zoom chat from before where he pointed out that high interest rates can slow down capital improvements and startup companies, and that's a bad thing. And yeah, I mean, that's always true. It always affects both, right? It affects the speculative investment and it affects the real investment. So there's a point where you wouldn't want to tighten any further because the cost of slowing down real capital improvements would outweigh the benefit of reining in any further speculation or something like that. So it's a balance. You have to find the right balance. So this was a great discussion. International trade is interesting and international monetary systems are interesting. One of the cool things about the gold standard was that you really did have this international kind of fixed standard. The gold was the currency internationally for international trade, and we have that to some extent now with the dollar, but it's not exactly the same thing. Every country that was on the gold standard, their currencies were essentially interchangeable with each other, and the central banks were making sure that stayed that way. We don't have that anymore. We have foreign exchange markets that are, you have all these dealers and buying and selling foreign exchange, and that whole mechanism had to develop, and that's part of what kind of stabilizes things. But they also bounce around a lot too. So there's something that was lost, and maybe we can get it back through a fiat currency that looks more like what the gold standard looked like. When we were on Bretton Woods, people maybe looked more directly like people were pegged to the dollar, which was still kind of pegged to gold. But maybe you could have that or something like that without the gold backing, that kind of thing. So just some thoughts. I think in terms of thinking about trade and thinking about winning at trade and trade deficits and all of that, it gets a lot simpler to think about it if you are not thinking about workers and jobs and wages. If you're just ignoring all of that and you're thinking about, okay, well, the trade-off is not with employment, it's not with wages. The trade-off is between, specializing and getting that efficiency versus having redundancy if you need it. So that's it. Good discussion, you guys. Next week, we are talking about chapter 6, which is entitled, You're Entitled. So talk to you guys next week.
Thanks, Alex.
Yep.
Thanks, guys.
I wanna